Welcome to MindSpark Daily. What if I told you that some of the healthiest foods in your fridge might be slightly radioactive? It sounds like science fiction, but it's true. From bananas to spinach, radiation may be hiding in plain sight, and it's more common than you think. We're constantly told to eat clean and make healthier choices, but how often do we stop to think about what's really in our food? Today, we're diving into a surprising and often overlooked topic: radioactive foods. And no, we're not talking about Chernobyl-exclusive cuisine. We're talking about everyday items you probably eat all the time. Watch until the end to see which foods made the list and how you can stay safe. Section 1. What is food radiation? Radiation in food isn't always man-made or dangerous. In fact, some foods contain natural radioisotopes, like potassium-40 and radium-226, that are part of the Earth's makeup. These substances can be absorbed by plants from the soil or by animals through the food chain. But there's a big difference between natural background radiation and radioactive contamination. The latter can occur due to nuclear accidents, industrial waste, or even contaminated irrigation water. Section 2. Naturally radioactive foods. Let's talk bananas. They're famous for being radioactive thanks to their potassium-40 content. But don't worry, you'd need to eat millions of bananas at once for it to be harmful. Other naturally radioactive foods include Brazil nuts, known to contain radium absorbed from deep root systems. Carrots and potatoes. They absorb elements like radon and uranium if grown in mineral-rich soil. Red meat and dairy products. These can accumulate radioactive isotopes if the animals graze on contaminated plants. In these cases, the radiation levels are so low that they're usually harmless. But things get more concerning when contamination enters the picture. Section 3. Contaminated foods and environmental exposure. Some foods become contaminated due to environmental events. One of the most notorious cases was the Chernobyl disaster, which led to long-term radioactive fallout across Europe. Even decades later, wild mushrooms and berries in some regions still test positive for cesium-137. Fukushima in Japan is another example. After the 2011 nuclear incident, high levels of radiation were detected in local seafood. Since radiation can bioaccumulate, fish at the top of the food chain, like tuna or swordfish, can show higher contamination levels than smaller species. Surprisingly, leafy greens like kale and spinach can also retain radioactive dust particles from polluted air or water, especially if grown near industrial sites. Section 4. Routes of contamination. Radioactive contamination can reach food through several pathways. Soil contamination. Crops absorb radioactive elements from the earth. Water pollution. Irrigation using contaminated water introduces harmful isotopes into food. Airborne particles. Dust and fallout from nuclear accidents can settle on plants and water sources. And once those particles enter the food chain, they don't just disappear. They can travel, multiply, and pose long-term risks. Section 5. Health risks of long-term exposure. While occasional exposure to low levels of natural radiation is not typically harmful, long-term or high-level exposure to radioactive isotopes like cesium-137, strontium-90, and iodine-131 can increase risks of cancer, thyroid disorders, bone and blood disorders, genetic mutations, particularly in developing fetuses and children. This is why contaminated food safety monitoring is critical, not just during nuclear events, but also in everyday agriculture and fisheries. Section 6. Which foods to watch closely. Some foods are more prone to radioactive contamination based on how and where they're grown. Seafood from polluted waters, especially bottom dwellers like shellfish. Mushrooms and root vegetables, due to soil exposure. Leafy greens, because they absorb airborne contaminants. Wild game, animals that feed on contaminated plants can pass radiation into their meat. Countries with stricter regulations like Norway, Japan, and Germany monitor imported and locally produced foods closely. But in many parts of the world, transparency is still lacking. Section 7. What you can do. Here are a few tips to protect yourself. Diversify your diet to avoid repeated exposure from a single source. Buy local when possible, and research the growing conditions of your food. Rinse fruits and vegetables thoroughly, especially leafy greens. Support sustainable organic farms that use clean soil and water sources. Stay updated on recalls and contamination reports from trusted regulatory agencies like the FDA, EPA, or your country's Food Safety Authority. The idea of radiation in your food may sound scary, but with awareness and informed choices, you can minimize your risk. Not all radiation is dangerous, but knowing where it comes from and how it behaves in the environment makes all the difference. Have you ever come across radioactive food warnings in your area? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our next video for practical tips on decoding food labels and avoiding hidden toxins.